Hire me as your wife. I can bear children. I beg, said the Apache woman to the retired cowboy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Adam Rourke had been living alone in the Wyoming Territory for nearly 10 years. At 40, his body still carried the strength of a working cowboy, but time and old injuries had slowed him. His right leg stiffened whenever the cold came down from the mountains, and most days he walked with a faint limp. Once he had drifted from ranch to ranch, good with cattle and steady with a rifle, but the war and the loss of his wife years earlier had stripped him of interest in much beyond survival. His days were simple now: chopping wood, tending a small number of cattle, mending fences, and keeping to himself. He avoided the saloon and the talk of town. Silence suited him. He had no mission left, only the habit of staying alive. That evening, with dusk falling across the plains, Adam was stacking firewood near the cabin wall. The air carried a sharp bite, the kind that meant the first freeze wasn't far. He felt the ache in his leg and decided it was enough for the day. He was halfway to the door when he noticed movement on the road. A figure approached, slow and unsteady, as though each step was an effort. His hand drifted toward the rifle by the door out of instinct, but he didn't lift it. She came into view, barefoot and wrapped in a torn cotton dress that had clearly been worn through months of hard travel. The neckline had frayed open, revealing the upper curve of her chest, not by choice, but because the cloth had given out. The hem was ripped high enough to show raw skin on her shins, scratched and bruised. Her long black hair was partly braided, but the braid had come loose. She looked young, but not a child, closer to 30 than 20, and carried herself like someone who had learned to endure pain without complaint. She stopped at the step of his cabin and looked up at him, eyes fixed, breathing fast from the last climb over the rise. There was no hesitation in her words, though her voice trembled from cold and exhaustion. "Hire me as your wife," she said in broken English. "I can cook. I can clean. I beg." Adam froze. He had not heard that kind of plea in years, not since the war when desperate voices had carried through burned-out camps. His first thought was suspicion. Why he or why him? The second was pity, sharper than he expected. He saw the shiver in her arms and the blue in her lips. She wouldn't last the night outside. He weighed the risks. Townfolk already whispered about him. If he took her in, the talk would spread wider and nastier. But letting her walk back into the cold meant death on his conscience. That was something he couldn't live with. He stepped back from the doorway and opened it wide. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Get warm. Eat." She hesitated a second, as though expecting a trap, then crossed the threshold. She kept her back close to the wall, eyes scanning the room quickly. Table, stove, rifle over the door, a cot in the corner. Adam noticed the way her hands shook, not just from cold but from nerves. He recognized it. He had felt it himself after battles, when you wait for what's coming next and pray it isn't worse. He set beans and bread on a tin plate and slid it toward her on the table. "Sit." She lowered herself slowly, keeping one arm across her chest to cover the torn neckline. She ate without looking at him, small bites at first, careful. He saw the way she paused between each mouthful, testing whether her stomach could handle the food. Adam moved quietly around the room, stoking the fire, filling her cup with watered-down coffee. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She wasn't broken. Desperate, yes, but not broken. When she had finished, he nodded toward the cot. "That's yours tonight. Longer if you need it. No price." Her eyes flicked to his, surprised, searching for a hidden meaning. He kept his voice steady. "You're safe here. No one will force you." Her shoulders loosened just a little. She looked at the cot, then back at him. "Name is Saya," she said quietly. "Adam," he answered. For a moment, the silence felt heavy, filled with all the questions neither asked. Why she was here, what had driven her out, whether she truly trusted him. But neither pressed. The night was cold enough, and trust would have to come slowly, if at all. Adam gave her one of his shirts to cover herself better. She slipped it on quickly, buttoned it to her throat, and for the first time he saw her breathe easier. He showed her the water bucket, the latch on the door, the basin for washing. He even pulled the rifle down from its hooks and set it aside, explaining, "Habit, not for you." She nodded, understanding the gesture. When it came time to bank the fire and dim the lamp, he stretched out on his own bed, facing the wall to give her privacy. She lay on the cot, eyes on the ceiling, blanket pulled to her chin. He listened to her breathing settle, slow and steady now, and felt the weight of his decision ease. In his head, he told himself this was temporary, just until she was strong enough to move on. But another part of him, the part that remembered what silence used to feel like when the house was empty, knew already that things had changed the moment she stepped through his door. The pale light of morning broke through the cracks in the shutters, sharp and cold against the wooden walls. Adam stirred awake on his bed, stiff as always in the bad leg, and for a moment forgot she was there. Then he turned his head and saw her on the cot, still under the blanket, eyes open and watching the ceiling as if measuring the weight of the room. She shifted when she noticed him looking, drawing the blanket higher over her chest. He sat up slow, rubbed his face with his palm, and thought about what was expected of him now. He had let her in, given her food and a bed. But the question remained, what did she believe this meant? Did she think she had been bought? Did she expect him to act on the words she had spoken at his door? The thought unsettled him. He needed her to know he hadn't taken her in for that. He pulled on his boots and stood, leg aching until he found his balance. She rose too, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her voice was quiet but steady when she asked, "You want me to cook?" Adam shook his head once. "You don't owe me that. You don't owe me anything," he said plainly. "You're safe here. No one's going to force you." She studied him, as though testing if he meant it, then lowered her eyes. "I work," she said. "I don't sit." He let out a short breath, knowing there was no changing her mind. "All right, work is fine, but you choose what you do. No bargain, no price." That settled something between them. She stood and pulled on the shirt he had given her the night before, the sleeves too long, the buttons closing tight over the frayed neckline of her dress. It gave her dignity back, and he was glad he'd thought to offer it. He handed her a bucket, pointed to the well, and showed her the iron ring that had to be lifted so the lid wouldn't slam. "Water's the first chore," he said. "I'll split wood." They went about it in silence. He chopped kindling in the yard, glancing over once to see her wrestle with the bucket and lower it careful into the well. She moved awkwardly at first, but managed, pulling it up with a grunt of effort. She spilled some and cursed under her breath in her language. He walked over, took the rope, and showed her the easier way to brace it against the post. "Like this. Use the weight of the wood," he said. She tried again, and this time brought it up full without wasting a drop. Inside, she cooked cornmeal mush in the pan and set it on the table with the last of the coffee. Adam ate without a word, but he noticed the way she avoided meeting his eyes, as though waiting for him to correct her or criticize. He said only, "Good," and saw her shoulders ease, just enough. Later that morning, he fetched a small tin box and placed it on the table. Inside were a few spools of thread and bent needles, relics of years when he hadn't mended his own shirts. "For your dress," he said. "You can fix it if you want." She opened the tin, threaded a needle quick, and began stitching the torn hem with neat, practiced motions. Adam sat at the table, carving a new handle for his axe, and let the sound of the thread pulling through cloth fill the room. The way she worked told him this wasn't the first time she'd had a patch of dress down to scraps. He wondered where she had come from, what she had been through, but didn't ask. Questions could wait. By midday, he told her they'd need supplies soon. Flour was running low, and coffee nearly gone. He hesitated before saying the rest. "You'll need boots. A coat. This cold will cut you down otherwise." She looked up from her stitching, expression hard. "I pay with work, not with myself." Adam met her eyes and held them. "I never asked for that. Don't mistake me." His voice was flat, firm enough to leave no doubt. Something in her face shifted. The suspicion gave way to the smallest hint of relief. She went back to sewing, this time with her jaw less tight. The day wore on with simple labor. She swept the floor with a bundle of twigs she bound herself, washed the plates in the basin, and hung his shirt near the stove to dry after scrubbing it in cold water. He mended fence posts until his leg forced him to stop, and when he came inside, she was kneeling by the fire, hair falling loose as she banked the coals. Her silhouette in the lamplight looked strong and tired at once. That night, before he doused the lamp, she asked the first question since stepping through his door. Why here? Her English was halting, but her meaning was clear. Why did he live in this cabin, alone, on the edge of nothing? Adam leaned on the chair back, considering how much to tell. I worked cattle, drifted, then I lost my wife. Stayed here after that. No one waits for me anywhere else. She nodded slowly, understanding more from his tone than his words. I was cast out, she said after a pause. No one waits for me too. The room went quiet again. Adam lowered the lamp, the fire casting the only light. They lay down on their separate beds, but the silence no longer felt as sharp. Both of them knew something had shifted, that they were not just surviving the night anymore. They were beginning to carry each other's weight, even if only in the smallest ways. The following morning carried a gray light and a biting wind that rattled the loose boards on the side of the cabin. Adam rose early, restless. He had decided the night before that they couldn't wait much longer to go into town. Flour was nearly gone. The coffee tin rattled with only enough left for one pot, and he needed nails and oil before the fences weakened further. More than that, she needed boots and a coat. He had lain awake thinking on it, knowing the town wouldn't let them pass without stares and talk. Still, it had to be done. He told her at breakfast. She listened without flinching, her spoon hovering above the bowl of cornmeal mush she had cooked. They will look, she said quietly. Her English was clipped, careful. They will, he admitted. He didn't want to lie to her. But you'll walk in with me. You'll have what you need. She nodded once, accepting it. But Adam noticed the way her fingers tightened on the spoon. The same tension he had seen in himself before walking into a saloon he knew was unfriendly. By mid-morning, he hitched the wagon, and she climbed up beside him, still in the patched dress with his shirt layered over it. The sight of her bare legs against the cold bothered him. He draped a blanket over her knees and said nothing more, letting the horses pull them toward Dust Creek. The ride was long and quiet. Adam found himself watching the road more than usual, glancing at the hills for riders, though he knew there was little danger. Old habits died hard. Saya sat upright, her hands folded under the blanket, eyes fixed on the horizon. He wondered what she thought of this land. Flat stretches broken only by cottonwoods and ridges in the distance, so different from where she had come from. He didn't ask. Dust Creek appeared as a cluster of weathered buildings. Mercantile, livery, saloon, a few houses scattered further back. As soon as the wagon rolled down the main street, eyes turned their way. Men leaned against posts, women paused with baskets in their hands, and conversation fell quieter. Adam kept his gaze straight ahead, jaw set. He had lived with the whispers for years. Now, they had a sharper edge. He guided the wagon to the mercantile, set the brake, and climbed down. His leg protested, stiff from the ride, but he ignored it. He offered his hand up to Saya. She hesitated before taking it, then stepped down. The torn hem of her dress shifted in the wind, showing the bruises on her calves. She pulled the blanket closer around her, but kept her chin high. Inside, the mercantile smelled of flour and kerosene. Adam walked to the counter and asked for 2 sacks of flour, beans, salt, lamp oil, and nails. He added, "Need boots for her. Size small." The clerk glanced at Saya, then back at Adam. His mouth twitched, but he fetched the boots. Behind them, 2 men by the stove muttered. One said louder than needed, didn't know Rourke was keeping company now. A laugh followed. Saya stood very still, arms crossed over her chest to hide the gaping neckline. Adam turned his head just enough to meet the men's eyes. His look was steady, hard. They turned back to their talk. He said nothing more. The clerk set a box on the counter and pulled out a pair of plain leather boots. Adam set them on the floor. "Try them," he said. Saya sat on the bench, slid her feet into the boots, and laced them carefully. They fit snug. For the first time since he had met her, she allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Quick, gone in a second. Adam added a wool dress and a coat to the list. The clerk wrapped them in brown paper and tied it with twine. Adam paid in coin, then took the parcel and handed it to her. "Yours," he said simply. She held the package tight, as though someone might take it. "Thank you," she said softly. When they stepped outside, the street had not lost its stares. A woman by the sugar barrels whispered to another, both eyes on Saya. Adam helped her into the wagon and set the goods in the back. As he climbed onto the seat, she asked the question he had known was coming. Why help me? Not others. Adam gripped the reins, thinking. He wasn't a man used to explaining himself. Because you were at my door in the cold, he said finally. And no one should be turned away like that. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether this was truth or something less. Then she nodded and turned her eyes to the road. The ride back was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet as before. The distance between them felt smaller. Adam caught her once with her hand resting lightly on the parcel in her lap, her thumb moving across the twine as if it anchored her to the seat. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped low and the air was colder. Adam unloaded the wagon while she carried the lighter things inside. He watched her place the boots by the hearth, smooth her hand across the parcel, and stand still for a moment as though letting herself believe it was real. That night, when the lamps burned low, Adam felt the shift. She was no longer just a desperate stranger on his doorstep. She was beginning to take her place in the cabin. And though he would never admit it aloud, a part of him felt lighter for it. 2 nights after their return from town, the weather turned. The day had been mild enough, but by evening a storm came fast from the west, first with heavy rain that slapped against the shutters, then sleet that rattled like gravel on the roof. The wind pushed hard at the walls, whistling through every seam. Inside, the stove glowed red and the lamplight hung low. Saya worked steadily at the hearth, boiling potatoes in the iron pot. Adam sat at the table with a broken chair leg braced across his knees, a chisel in his hand. He tried to keep his focus on the wood, but the ache in his shoulder grew sharper with each strike. The injury was an old one. Years back, a fall from a horse during a roundup, but storms made it flare. He shifted his weight, telling himself to push through, but when he stood to fetch another tool, his boot slipped on the wet boards near the back door. His shoulder slammed against the jamb, sending pain shooting down his arm. He cursed under his breath, the sound tight and frustrated. Saya was at his side before he could brush it off. She took the chisel from his hand and set it aside without asking. Adam opened his mouth to say he didn't need help, but her look stopped him. She unbuttoned his shirt halfway, the lamplight catching the bruise already blooming dark across his shoulder. Her fingers were gentle but certain, pressing along the line of the muscle. "It's not new," he muttered, embarrassed by how much it hurt. Her eyes lifted to his. Pain is pain, old or new. Her English was broken, but her meaning was sharp. She heated a cloth in the pot of water, wrung it out, and pressed it against the bruise. Adam sucked in a breath at the heat, but the relief followed quick after. She tied the cloth firm, her braid falling forward over her shoulder as she leaned close. The neckline of her new wool dress gaped slightly as she worked, the firelight showing the curve of her chest, but Adam kept his eyes fixed on her face. "You don't have to," he began. "I know," she cut in, voice quiet but steady. She finished tying the cloth and sat back, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a long moment they stayed like that, the storm pounding on the roof, the air between them heavy. Adam lifted a hand, meaning only to thank her, but his fingers brushed her jaw. She didn't move away. His palm rested there, rough against her skin, and she leaned closer. Their lips met in a kiss that was slow, steady, and certain, nothing hurried, just the kind of closeness both had held back too long. When they parted, her forehead rested against his for a breath. Then she stood and banked the stove. Adam stayed seated, shoulder throbbing less now, but his chest full in a way he hadn't felt in years. Before they sat down to sleep, he said, "You can have this home without a price on you. You're not here to be owned." She turned, her face softened by the firelight. "I want to stay if staying is clean." "It is," he answered, and meant it. That night, as the storm dragged on, the cabin felt smaller but warmer. The sound of rain and sleet outside carried on, but inside there was a shift no weather could undo. The storm broke by morning, leaving the yard heavy with puddles and mud. The air carried the smell of wet clay, sharp and raw. Adam rose slow, his shoulder bound with a strip of cloth Saya had tied the night before. She was already up, kneeling at the stove, coaxing the coals back to life. When she turned toward him, her eyes were steady. No guarded distance this time. Something had shifted between them the night before, and both knew it. Adam washed at the basin, movement stiff. He studied her from the corner of his eye as she worked. For weeks he had avoided asking the questions that pressed at him. Where she had come from, why she had chosen his door of all doors. But now the silence between them felt different. If he didn't ask, the listeners to their story would. He sat at the table as she placed bread and coffee down in front of him. The bread was coarse, a little burned at the edges, but it was warm, and he ate it without complaint. He cleared his throat. "There's something I never asked," he said. His voice was quiet, not from weakness, but from habit. "You could have gone to another place. Another farm. Why mine?" Saya's hands paused over the pan she was drying. She didn't look up right away. When she finally spoke, her English was careful. "Others would sell me back, or take me for body. You." She met his eyes then. "You did not." Adam sat with that a moment, uneasy at what it revealed. She hadn't chosen him because she saw safety in him. She had chosen him because everywhere else was worse. Still, he felt something tighten in his chest that she trusted him enough to say it aloud. The day's work left no time for more talk. Fences had to be checked, and fallen branches cleared from the yard after the storm. Saya moved through chores with quick precision, sweeping mud out the door, hanging his damp shirt near the stove, and carrying water from the well without slipping once. Adam noticed how she had learned the rhythm of the cabin in such a short time. She closed his fingers around it and said, "I stay by my will." Her words hung in the air longer than any vow. Adam didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The cabin, once silent and hollow, carried something different now. Something alive. The fever left Adam weak for several days. But when strength returned, he threw himself back into work as if to prove nothing had been lost. Saya didn't stop him, but she watched closely, stepping in when she saw him wince or stumble. Her presence was no longer that of a guest testing her welcome. She moved through the cabin and the yard with purpose, as though she belonged. Word of her presence spread further in town. Dust Creek was small, and tongues moved quicker than wagons. At the mercantile, men leaned on the counter and asked questions they pretended were casual. Rourke really keeping an Apache woman out there? He pay her, or she pay him? Adam heard enough of it to know the talk would not die on its own. The first real trouble came on a Saturday. Adam had driven the wagon in for nails, lamp oil, and salt. Saya came with him because he wouldn't leave her alone, not with strangers wandering through the territory. She wore the wool dress he had bought her, boots laced tight, and the coat drawn close, her hair braided neat. Still, the stairs followed them through the street like shadows. At the hitching rail outside the mercantile, two young cowhands lingered. One stepped forward, grinning wide, and reached for Saya's sleeve as if to test how far he could go. Before she could pull back, Adam set himself between them. His voice was low, controlled, but sharp enough to cut through the noise of the street. "Leave off." The cowhand's grin faltered. He glanced at Adam's leg, at the way the man leaned heavy on it, and thought he saw weakness. But Adam's eyes told another story. After a long second, the boy's hand dropped. "Ain't no harm," he muttered. His partner tugged at his sleeve, and they stepped away. Inside the mercantile, the clerk watched the whole thing, eyes narrowed but silent. Adam set his list on the counter, his voice clipped. "Flour, beans, nails, salt, oil," he added, "and paper, ink." The clerk raised a brow. "Paper?" Adam didn't explain. He paid in coin, gathered the goods, and walked Saya back outside. They drove straight from the mercantile to the office of the Justice of the Peace. The man was old, his hands spotted, his eyes tired. He looked up from a ledger when Adam walked in. "What brings you, Rourke?" Adam placed his hat on the desk. "Need a paper written. States she's employed here on wages. Board, food, freedom to move. Clear as ink can make it." The justice glanced at Saya, then back at Adam. "You could just marry her." "Not yet," Adam said firmly. Saya spoke for herself then, her English broken but strong. "We decide. No one else." The justice studied them, then nodded. Fair enough. He scratched out the words, the pen squeaking across paper, then stamped it with his seal. He slid it across the desk. Adam folded it and tucked it inside his coat. Outside, under the sun, Adam turned to her. This keeps them from claiming your runaway property. It's not everything, but it's something. Saya's eyes held his. I spoke. I chose. They must hear. They will, Adam said, and for the first time he believed it. That night, back at the cabin, he pulled out a small box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a phonograph, one of the only things he had kept from his wife's days. The records were scratched, but still played. He wound the crank and set the needle down. The thin sound of a fiddle filled the room, crackling but alive. Saya looked at him, uncertain. He stood, held out his hand, and waited. Slowly, she set her palm in his. They moved in a small circle between the table and the stove. Her body pressed close under the coat, his hand steady at her waist. Neither spoke. The music was enough. When the record ended, they didn't step apart right away. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the beat of his heart, steady and real. Adam stood still, feeling how natural it had become to hold her. The cabin was no longer silent. It carried voices now, soft, few in number, but enough to change the shape of his life. Spring came slow, the snowpack thinning first along the ridges where sunlight lingered, then in the flats where water pooled and turned the earth heavy. Adam worked the land as best he could, cutting shallow furrows and sowing seed while the soil was damp enough to take it. His leg dragged worse in the mud, but he pushed through. Saya was beside him in every task, hauling buckets, guiding the mule, and steadying fence posts when he drove nails. She no longer asked where her place was in the cabin or in the yard. She had claimed it with her hands and her effort. The townsfolk's whispers had not stopped, but the sign paper gave her ground to stand on, and Adam knew that mattered. Still, questions lingered about her past, about whether she had family still alive, about what she wanted for her future. Adam thought of these things when he lay awake at night, but he did not press her. Trust had been built slow, and he would not risk breaking it by asking before she was ready. One evening, after a day of heavy work, they washed at the basin side by side. The water was cold from a spring, their hands raw from dirt and wood. Adam caught her watching him in the glass of the darkened window, her eyes steady, not guarded. He dried his hands on a rag and sat at the chair by the fire, and when she came near, he saw her decision already made. She touched his shoulder lightly, not in the way of mending a bruise or checking a wound, but with intent. Adam looked up at her, reading her expression. Only if you want, he said, his voice even. I want with you, she answered. He rose slowly, his legs stiff, and guided her toward his bed, the one that had sat empty for so many years. The air was quiet except for the low crackle of the fire. She untied the braid from her hair and let it fall loose. He slid her coat from her shoulders, his fingers brushing the edge of her wool dress. She did not look away. They undressed without rush, each movement measured, as if testing the boundary between what they had been and what they were about to become. Adam traced the scar at her ribs with a rough hand, and she pressed her palm over his, not to stop him, but to show she accepted the weight of what he saw. The neckline of her dress slipped down, baring her chest in the lamplight. She guided his hand there, her breath steady, and when he bent to kiss her, she pulled him close with both arms. Their bodies moved together slow, finding rhythm in the closeness, not in urgency. Adam held her as though she might vanish if he let go. Saya gave back the same, her nails pressing into his shoulders, her breath breaking against his ear. It was not just heat, not just need. It was the long silence between them finally broken in the only way it could be. Afterward, they lay side by side, the quilt drawn over them, the fire fading low. Saya rested her hand over his heart, her head against his shoulder. She whispered, I thought I would never choose a man. Not after. She stopped there, her eyes closing as if to block the memories. Adam tightened his arm around her. You chose, he said simply. She nodded against him. And for the first time since she had stepped into his cabin, he saw her at rest. Not just surviving, not just enduring, resting with him. The questions that had hovered in the background, about where she had come from, about whether this was temporary, lost their edge in that moment. Adam understood that she had chosen not only to stay, but to bind herself to him. And he, who had lived too long in silence, chose her in return. The house, once hollow, now held them both. Not as strangers, not as bargain keepers, as man and wife in all but name. The weeks after they had crossed that unspoken line passed with a steadier rhythm. Adam and Saya worked the land together, side by side, without needing to speak much. The cabin no longer felt split into his space and hers. It was theirs. The phonograph had become a quiet companion in the evenings, the fiddle scraping through old tunes while she mended clothes or while he sharpened tools. Yet, as much as the walls felt safe, Adam knew the outside world had not forgotten them. Trouble came just after midday, on a Sunday when the air carried dust and the sun stood high. Two riders approached from the south, badges pinned crooked on their vests. Their horses drank at the trough before the men swung down and walked to the door. Adam stepped outside before they could knock. Saya stayed just inside, her hand resting on the doorframe, her eyes steady. The taller of the men spoke first. "We're following a complaint from a freighter down near Sweetwater. Says he had a labor woman run off. Apache by the looks of it. Matches her description." He jerked his chin toward the door. "We'll be taking her in." Adam didn't move, didn't even glance back. He kept his voice even. "She's no runaway. She works here under wages. Papers signed by the justice of the peace in Dust Creek." He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded sheet, and held it up. The shorter rider took it, scanned the lines with a scowl, then shoved it back. "That may be so," the tall one said, "but word in town says otherwise. Folks don't like the look of it. Could be fines, could be worse." Saya stepped forward then, not waiting to be spoken for. Her voice was sharp, her English plain. "I'm not owned. I stay here by my will." Her hand pressed flat against the doorframe, shoulders straight. She wasn't trembling. She wanted them to hear her. The shorter man smirked. "A lot of talk for a woman who don't belong here." Before Adam could answer, another horse came up from the east trail. It was Harris, a neighbor who kept a small spread 2 miles over. He reined in, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, Rourke. Everything all right?" His eyes slid to the riders and narrowed. The tall man shifted. "Nothing to see here. Just making inquiries." Harris spat in the dirt. Rourke straight. "Been here longer than any of us. If you're looking for trouble, you won't find it." The silence stretched. Finally, the riders swung back into their saddles. "Keep your papers handy," one muttered. "We'll be back if there's more complaint." They turned their horses and rode off, dust rising in their wake. Adam watched them go until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. Saya stepped down onto the porch beside him. "They will come again," she said. "Maybe," Adam answered. He folded the paper and tucked it back inside his coat. "But they'll find the same answer waiting." That night, after the day's tension had settled, Adam sat at the table with a small box in front of him. He had taken it down from the shelf where it had gathered dust for years. Inside was a plain silver ring, not new, but still whole. He pushed it across the table toward her. "I don't want to bargain anymore," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was no hesitation. "I want a marriage if you want it too." Saya touched the ring, her fingers brushing the worn metal. Then she reached across the table, set her hand on his cheek, and looked at him without wavering. "Yes," she said simply. The fire burned low, but the cabin felt warmer than it had ever been. For the first time since she had stood barefoot at his door, there were no doubts between them. The choice was theirs, and theirs alone. They chose not to wait long. Within a week, Adam and Saya rode into Dust Creek with Harris and his wife as witnesses. The justice of the peace stood under the cottonwood by the creek, ledger in hand, spectacles sliding down his nose. The ceremony was short. No choir, no church bells, just the rush of water and the spring air sharp with willow. Adam repeated the words firmly, his jaw set as though he was swearing an oath in battle. Saya spoke slower, her English careful, but her voice carried. "I am his wife. He is my husband." When Adam slid the plain ring onto her finger, she smiled, not broad, but enough to show the weight had lifted from her shoulders. The justice closed the ledger with a snap. "That's the end of it," he said. "You're married by law and land both." Harris clapped Adam on the back, and his wife embraced Saya, whispering, "You're safe now. No one can touch you." For the first time, Adam saw Saya lean into another woman's arms without bracing herself for harm. It mattered. They rode home in silence, the wagon heavy with flour and seed. Adam's hand rested on the bench between them, not quite touching hers, but close enough that when she slid her fingers into his, he didn't let go until they reached the yard. Summer came on fast. The garden grew thick, beans climbing their poles, potatoes pushing strong under the soil. The cattle grazed heavy, coats shining in the sun. Adam built a cradle in the evenings, cutting and sanding the boards with care. Saya stitched a quilt for it, piecing together scraps of her old dress with new cloth. When she set it in the cradle, the torn cotton that once marked her hunger became part of a pattern. Something whole, something claimed. By late August, Saya took Adam's hand and pressed it against her belly. His fingers stilled, his breath caught. She nodded, her eyes bright. "Spring," she said simply. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed, overcome by the weight of it. For years, he had lived without expecting anything more than another sunrise. Now the thought of a child filled his chest with something he had no name for. The town still whispered, but none dared challenge them again. Adam kept the sign paper in the chest, though it was no longer needed. The ring on her hand and the ledger in the justice's book carried more weight than talk ever could. One evening, as dusk settled over the plains, Adam and Saya sat on the porch stepped together. The dog lay stretched beneath the rail, the creek murmured in the distance, and the sky carried the first star. Saya leaned her head on his shoulder, her braid brushing his arm. Adam wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her close. For a long while, neither spoke. The quiet was not empty anymore, it was full. Adam thought back to the night she had stood barefoot at his door, begging for work, begging for survival. He remembered his hesitation, the choice he had made to let her in. Everything after had grown from that single act. Now there was no bargain, no question, no unfinished business. They had a marriage, a home, and a child on the way. When the last light faded, Adam rose, helped Saya to her feet, and led her inside. The door closed behind them, not to shut the world out, but to keep safe what they had built together. The story of Adam Rourke and Saya did not end with loneliness or uncertainty. It ended with a home, a family, and the promise of a future that neither had dared to imagine before.